Hello and happy Friday, everybody. My name is John Solheit, and I'm here with the second installment of the Scholars Forum on Patristics Cast, or Patristic Cast. I just changed the name. And today I am so very delighted to welcome Dr. Christoph Markschies, who is professor and chair of ancient Christianity at Humboldt Universität in Berlin. He has formerly been a chair of historical theology at Heidelberg University. Is that correct, from what I gathered on your CV?
Absolutely.
PhD 1991 from Tübingen, and his habilitation in 1994 on Arius, or Arianism, correct?
In the Latin West, the question how Ambrose of Milan managed to translate Greek theology and Greek thinking to Latin-speaking people in the West.
Okay. Now, this is an important distinction. There's a house of Dominican friars here in Toronto, and a few years back, they invited a scholar here for, I think he spent about a year and a half here. He's in Berlin now, or Potsdam to be correct. And this is where I first got acquainted with the German system of higher education, where not only do you have to complete a doctoral dissertation, you also have to complete a habilitation, which is a completely separate project. So for many people here who might be watching in North America might not be familiar with how demanding the German higher education system is.
Yes, but to be honest, there is something comparable. A 10-year position you will never get without a second book. And so it's, how to say, habilitation is comparable to the recommendation to write a second book and a certain exam in teaching experience. And I think the idea to test the teaching ability of someone before allowing him to be a 10-year professor or her a 10-year professor at a university is perhaps a very traditional idea. There are traditional elements in a quite hierarchical German university system, but the idea to have a short test before people were sent to the academic positions market, and there is a kind of testimonial of a university, yes, we think you should try it at the academic market, that gives a certain form of security or a more secure feeling to you. The Tübingen faculty has recommended me to test the academic positions market for 10 years positions, which is not in the same way comparable to the SPL circus, but is to another way comparable.
Okay, oh, very good. That makes sense. Thank you very much. Well, among your very many publications, your most recent publication is Gottes Körper, God's Body, which I do not have in the German, but this is a fantastic book, and hopefully I can have you back on where we can discuss this, because this is fascinating. But for today, I wanted to invite you on to talk about a book you published originally back in 2007, under the German title, and forgive my German here, Kaiserzeitliche Christliche Theologie und ihre Institutionen, published in, or translated into English in 2015 or 2016 by Baylor University Press under the title Christian Theology and its Institutions in the Early Roman Empire.
Your German was absolutely perfect.
Well, my German ancestors would be very proud to hear that. I just wish my ability to read German well and quickly was equally good. Unfortunately, it takes me a long time. Your sentence structure can be quite tricky to get through sometimes compared to English.
Yes, that's a serious difference, and also a difficulty of verbal translations from the German language to the English language. English sentences are far more shorter, but to express something in a shorter way than in a Baroque way is an interesting challenge. Please say it a little bit shorter. That is, are you really familiar? Are things thought to an end, or is it a little bit chaotic? And you can hide chaotic thoughts into a Baroque German structure better than in a clear-cut English structure. So, and that's a difficulty for people translating my text to the English. They had to cut down the Baroque sentences. One of my academic teachers said to me, "You have a quite Baroque way of expressing thoughts. There are people more easier to translate to the English language," I have to confess.
Well, I can't remember the story, how it goes, so I probably shouldn't say it, but I'm going to say it anyways. Karl Rahner, the very famous German Catholic theologian, his brother, what did his brother say? His goal was to retranslate Karl from the English back into German so that he would make more sense. Because in the English, it's almost impossible to get through Rahner without spending about a half hour on each page. But
one year before Rahner's death, I heard a lecture of him. There was a young student, and after the lecture, I discussed certain questions with Rahner in front of the room where he lectured. And then at the end, Rahner said, "Would you like to accompany me for a glass of wine?" And it's a real pity. I was in fear, and I thought, would I really be able to spend a whole evening, or would the great Rahner suddenly realize that I'm a very young student? And so I refused and said, "What was wrong? I'm tired and sorry I cannot come with you." And later I learned that Rahner quite often talked in this way to young students, and that, like the German philosopher Gadamer, he was deeply interested to came in contact with young students, and so I lost perhaps a large opportunity of my life. We don't know whether I would have become a patristic scholar or dealing with ancient Christianity if I would have refused the glass of wine with Karl Rahner.
Well, maybe at some point in the next life, you will be able to make up for that. And I would like to join you. That would be a very interesting conversation. So, Christian theology and its institutions. The basic thesis. I'm just going to read what you say here for your basic thesis. A basic thesis of this book is that a consideration of the different institutional context of Christian theology makes it possible to provide a description of commonalities and differences in ancient Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. That is both more precise and more able to achieve a consensus than usually happens today in connection with Bauer, Walter Bauer, and in opposition to him. Okay. How was it? Now, in your final chapter, you actually go through great detail in critiquing Bauer's thesis. But how was it that you arrived at this hypothesis that we really need to reconsider Christian theology in antiquity within its institutional context?
Because during the transition between being an assistant in Germany and at my first chair, I had for the first time, that's something specific of the German system. Only the chairs, the professors are allowed to lecture. Mm-hmm. So before lecturing and as a young assistant, I had to concentrate, like all my colleagues, on small topics, the introductory courses. And when I first had to prepare lectures as a professor, I suddenly realized the, how to say, one-sidedness of my academic training. I have nothing heard of liturgy. So theology, to be honest, was to a little extent a kind of prehistory of German professorship. Uh, the idea is there is Justin and the apologetic literature. They are first a little bit in contact with Platonism. They are citing certain Platonist sentences. And then came the great Origen. And Origen is like a German professor. He had certain difficulties with his money and buying books. He had certain problems to arrange his life, to have enough time for the work. And so I had the impression we as academic theologians are modeling ancient Christian theology far too much according to the paradigm. I'm talking about myself and the 90s of the last century. I'm not talking about today, and that's not something said in an unfriendly way about colleagues. It's something about my own academic training. And I got the impression that's far too much modeled according to the Middle European idea of theology at universities. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, if I'm going to write a history of Christian theology as a history of reflection of Christian religion in antiquity, I had it's necessary to clear up before writing such a history, the question in which institutional context that happened. And I got the impression liturgy, for example, is something where far more people came in contact with theology, with reflection, because singing a hymn was heard by a lot of people, and perhaps they were singing with the others, the hymn. Whether, and probably the number of people reading Gregory of Nyssa or someone else of the Cappadocians or Arius or whomever was far more smaller than those familiar with theology and liturgy. And so I got the impression my horizon, the focus on theology, would be far more greater when before writing something concrete on topics of Christian reflection, it would be a good idea to study the institutional framing of. And I had the impression that there was no comparable book. And one of my academic teachers said, don't repeat other books. So I thought that's a nice idea, something I had to clear for my own research. It's a selfish book to a certain extent, and perhaps something what would be of interest for other people.
Well, certainly of interest for me. And I suppose I should give credit where credit is due. Peter Martins, the Origin scholar, was my external examiner. And one of the recommendations he made for me as I turned my dissertation into a monograph was to take a look at your book on Christian institutions or Christian theology and institutions. Yeah. So Peter, if you're watching, thank you. It's been very helpful.
To him. Quite familiar and esteemed colleague.
Very much so. Okay, now you hinted at this in what you had just said when you contrasted the theology that emerges, so to speak, from liturgical settings and theology that comes from more of a scholastic school context, intellectual context, like the Cappadocians, Origen, so on and so forth. So in your first chapter, you make a very important distinction between implicit theology and explicit theology. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, there I have to confess that I took over this distinction from the famous Egyptologist Jan Assmann. But before explaining, I should first explain why on earth I made this distinction. I had the impression that's perhaps, I was trained not only in theology and classics, but also in philosophy. And so I have learned always first define, or if it's not possible, describe the basic terms using for a certain research project. And so I thought, define theology. And then it's quite clear when taking up the Greek term, theologia, you got the impression that there is a serious problem, because in the imperial Roman time, theology, the Greek term theologia normally means expressing something on God, on hymns. So John is the first theologian, using the Greek term in the 4th
evangelist
century.
John.
Yeah. And why? Because there is a hymn at the beginning. And I had the wonderful opportunity to check lots of Greek terms which are not included in the TLG in a famous card collection of Erik Peterson. Erik Peterson, a German New Testament scholar and patristic scholar who later moved to Rome and converted from Protestantism to Catholicism. Erik Peterson collected all Greek and Latin terms when reading classic texts to certain cards and put them in an arrangement according to the Greek and Latin alphabet. And that I did, and the wonderful thing that's preserved in Torino in his collections at the university. And when I did this for the Greek term, I thought it's not possible to analyze the history of Christian reflection with the Greek term. So I need another definition for theology. And then I thought our common definition, reflection according to norms or criteria which are taken by a certain time or by the university or whatever as rational, is problematic, because the theology of a hymn is definitely not constructed by the idea of a certain rationality according to the Platonic paradigm or the Stoic paradigm or whatever. So I thought I have to realize that there is something which is presented in public with the self-definition and the interest to get this reaction. That's rational reflection on. And that I'm calling explicit theology. And then there is something which is probably related to the same framework or to the same rules or to the same criteria, but it's not made explicit. And that I labeled implicit. So for example, the prologue of the Gospel of John is obviously oriented on certain ideas of rational reflection of the Jewish God in Alexandria according to certain Platonized Stoic ideas of a second principle of God. But there are no literal signs of that relation or that link. There is not said we are calling this logos like Plato did, or like the philosophers did, or the text isn't peppered by nice Plato citations. It's difficult to find the father of the universe, and everyone knows, oh, he read a certain amount of Platonic dialogues.
I'm curious, you didn't really bring it up in your book, but what do you think of the Syriac tradition? We get writers like Ephraim, the Syrian, and Isaac of Nineveh, who would have been very well trained in this intellectual, philosophical brand of theologizing, but oftentimes they produced poetry and hymns. So you, I don't know, would you see something of a confluence of implicit and explicit in some of the Syriac literature? I'm just curious. I don't know the answer to that question, but
no, that's a wonderful question, because there are two legs. When today writing the book, it's I think more than 15 years that I conceptualized the book. And I conceptualized the book during certain times in Jerusalem, during 2 sabbaticals in Jerusalem. The first problem is one of the institutions which are to a certain extent neglected in the book is the institution. We have also to talk about my understanding of institution, the institution of literary genres. Because also I defined institution not as a certain, there is comparable, the German and the English term institution means the post office, the Canadian government or so. No, this is a sociological understanding of institution as a form of stability in a certain order. Stability in a certain order. And to a certain extent, in the book, I was too much bound to the traditional understanding, the institution as school, university. And today, I think I would add a chapter on the institution of a literary genre, because there is also a certain stability. We have the nice definition of ancient encomium, that an encomium is presenting the person, for example, the emperor you're talking on, as the best of all the emperors. That's a clear-cut stable, and that means with stability, with institutional stability. And the question concerning the Syriacs is whether the idea of poetry in the Syriac language is a little bit different from most of Greek. There is perhaps something comparable. And so the question is implicit and explicit mixed. And these are, how to say, you have a graded scale, and explicit and implicit are also for Greek and Latin literature and for Coptic literature the ends of the scale. So most texts are somewhere in between. Often in texts of implicit theology, there are certain markers for readers. Hello, I'm a learned and experienced person, but according to the rules or the laws of poetry.
So, okay, you've gotten into institutions, and you make a very important definitional statement, working from Arnold Galen. And I'm gonna, so this is how you, the working definition of institutions that you provide. Institutions are defined by Galen as, quote, social arrangements that outwardly and inwardly effectively suggest and bring into force stability and duration, end quote, and in which especially, quote, the action guiding and communication directing foundations of an order are also always symbolically brought to expression, end quote. Action guiding, and communication directing foundations. What do you mean by that?
For example, take the Eucharistic liturgy as an institution, and the way in which this institution was established is communicated at the beginning, in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. And it's not communicated in form of a expressed speech. The service, the Eucharistic service, was constituted by Jesus Christ in this last Eucharist, or whatever. No, there is a kind of symbolic communication in the sense that in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so institutions, for example, the post office, German post offices of my childhood were communicating symbolically. That's not the barber shop next door, but it's something related to the German state. At the stamps is typed the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, the German state, is printing those, the whole post institution is related to the state, or was earlier related to the state before being privatized by the government, or half privatized. But that's probably the same also with US mail and Canadian and British and French and whatever.
So, okay, so action guiding and communication guiding. So another way to think about this perhaps is in academia. In the various branches or disciplines, we use certain language in our papers and books with which other scholars in the field are familiar. Mm-hmm. So the academic institution kind of teaches us to communicate in that way.
Yeah.
They also teach us to act in a certain way. We acquire certain skills, mm-hmm. Techniques or methodologies with which we, carry out our work. Does that kind of make sense in the action guiding and communication? I don't know. I sent you the video of my interview with John Kloppenborg from last week. I don't know if you had a chance to watch that yet. Yeah. There's so he's working with institutions as well, and he's working with Greco-Roman voluntary associations. And using network theory, he applies this concept, emergent properties. And he discusses this in the context of certain associations. And one of my favorite parts of the book was his little discourse on the boatmen and the registrars in Ostia, Italy. And he provides this mosaic of them in a boat, and each person is carrying out a particular task. And what he argues is the institution of the association, this particular association, provides them a space, but it provides them a space of belonging and connectivity to the city, but it also requires of them certain skills that, with which they can fit in. And I see an analogy with what you describe in your book when you look at the different institutional contexts. Am I wrong in seeing an analogy there?
Yes, there is an analogy. I think the difference is that my understanding of institution, according to Gehlen, is one example. According to the modern sociologist's view, is more open. So the interesting thing is not that the traditional way, when the German patristic scholars of the 19th and early 20th century declared we have to study the institutions. That's Harnack. Harnack in 1910 delivered a speech to students in Oslo. After a lot of lectures, they asked him, please, in a short way, what is doing Christianity as a historian? And then he said, the only thing we know quite clear are the institutions. And his institution is this simply reduced way of is canon, is the rule of faith, regula fidei, and the ecclesiastical orders. And that's a traditional way. The church, voluntary associations, and the question how church is related to them or is related to to certain Jewish structures of synagogue communities and so. My idea of institution is as a human person, you're living in absolutely different institutional contexts. And that's not only academia, that's also your parents, that's the group you're driving in the morning with a bus and talking and getting suddenly an impression of what other students from completely different faculties and completely academic. So every form, which is not only coined by stability, but it is also to a certain way communicating and impressing this form of stability. And so a group of students in the bus could be this. And I think that's the difference. When we are completely agree when dealing with these traditional institutions, but my focus is wider to avoid a difference between certain persons. There is nearly no life without institutions when using the wider understanding of the term institution.
You let's see here. You say this somewhere quite nicely that reminded me of a couple of things. If I can just find it here. But you make the point that people are social beings. You know, we're not defined solely by ourselves as an individual, but how we fit in different in society in general, but within these different sort of institutional frameworks. Reminded me of one of my professors from my master's program, the late Kevin Seasoltz, who was a Benedictine, a very interesting guy. He died in 2013 from multiple myeloma, and I visited him in the infirmary at St. John's Abbey, maybe like a month before he died. And he had all of his papers strewn about him. He had his laptop in front of him. He was working diligently up until the moment he died. I mean, that's a Benedictine for you, ora et labora. But there's also a very recent book that talks about institutions today, the family as an institution, for example. Yuval Levin, A Time to Build, where he talks about recommitting to these social institutions. Very interesting book. So I take your point that previously, when we look at institutions, we've been too narrowly focused. But if we look at it, really, institutions are all over the place. Sometimes it's more formal, government, for example. Sometimes it's the academy, but oftentimes, one of the principal institutions, like you say, is the family, the first social group, that we get to know going through life. And you bring this out then in your chapter on 3 institutional contexts. And so you talk about these intellectual contexts, different groups of teachers in their various contexts, the liturgy and Montanism. So maybe we can kind of take those apart a little bit. Talk about your work on the free teachers and perhaps the imprecise language of universities. I think, as you note, we shouldn't really think of universities in the modern sense, but certainly formal institutions in the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
it's extremely difficult to keep the middle position between paint the painting too alien from today's impressions and paint it too narrow. Because when there is a wonderful excavation, I think only mentioned in the footnotes of the book, in Alexandria, in the city center, a Polish excavation. And there they excavated obviously a kind of university, because there are lecture halls, and there is a larger number of small lecture halls with steps and a seat for the teacher in the steps, which is designed as the teacher's seat. And there is a kind of Odeon, a lecture hall, a larger lecture hall. The pity is we don't know anything about who was teaching there, what was the institutional structure. But interestingly, we have informations about the Platonic school. We have informations about a certain school in Ephesus, which is mentioned in the book. The inscription is presented and translated. And the wonderful thing is that we are able, now we should have Peter Martens with us, the institutional framework of what Origen did in Caesarea. Yeah. And the interesting impression is that the Caesarea way of doing Christian reflection is to a certain extent, and not only to a certain extent, to a large extent comparable to other pagan institutions of higher learning. I would label it institutions of higher learning, because university is so deeply related to. There were state-funded academic chairs in antiquity, but only a very small number. Most of them were, I would label it, private universities. It were universities funded by a private rich person with a kind of foundational money basis, and there were fees to pay or stipends so that people wouldn't have to pay. And the interesting thing is what we can learn about the Platonic Academy, the person which was responsible for the academic program, which was the leader or the president, was also responsible for preserving the money. So like in some foundations today, I don't know, probably the Rockefeller Foundation will have two different people, one responsible for the economic success of the Rockefeller Foundation and someone arranging the programs and thinking about the program design of Rockefeller Foundation. But in Germany, there are certain large foundations where the same person is responsible, like in the Platonic Academy, to preserve the foundational money, the capital, to the and deliver it to his successor, and also to develop an academic program.
Yeah, so state-funded, we have examples. Epictetus, for example, I think had a state-funded chair. Alexander of Aphrodisias, I think, was a state-funded chair. In contrast, in the Christian tradition, Justin Martyr led a private learning community in the upstairs of a Roman bathhouse. So there's an institution there, but it's not quite as structured as these state-run institutions. And then you have Origen, as you mentioned, a very peculiar case, because he's with Ambrose. My hypothesis about Origen's school in Caesarea is that it would be very comparable to Plotinus in Rome. Plotinus living with this pretty wealthy patroness, and she underwrites his scholarly activities. She has a family who, according to Porphyry, were able to benefit somewhat from the education. And you had all these other wealthy Roman elites coming. Origen, you might not, and they're contemporaneous in time. Plotinus a little bit younger than Origen, but with Origen and with Ambrose, very wealthy also, as Eusebius tells us, he underwrote all Origen's activities. And Origen tells us in a letter that I think was sent to Pope Fabian, that Ambrose keeps pestering him with propositions, and these propositions interfere with meal times, leisure times for walking, and they even interfere with times for textual studies, philologian, and readings. So they spent a lot of time together, and I think this is more of I think, as you indicate, a private institution funded by a wealthy patron, which would explain why the school didn't carry on after Origen died, I think. Because after Origen dies and after Ambrose dies, there's nobody there to sponsor the activities. But the writings still remain, and then Pamphilus and Eusebius received those. I don't know, that's my hypothesis anyway.
You're, in one sense, absolutely right, and that I can only underline, and that's that the idea of a patron is something which is perhaps completely unfamiliar to us, because someone giving money for a private university, don't know, is not in the same way like the patron Ambrose present in the academic life. So Origen's ideas, that's not only topical form of literature. My patron is forcing me to write this comment. No, there is someone interested, and indeed, what Pierre Hadot always said, it's not in the same way. When a philosopher in modern times is leaving the lecture hall, no one can test whether he is willing to translate or transform what he said to his own private life. Whether he is beating his children or something like that, no one knows. There is a complete break between academic life and the other life, and I think the developments are to higher the walls and borders in between. We should avoid to invite students at home, because all things what happened, Helmut Köster, and to mention all these absolutely horrific stories. It's a progress that we have these clear-cut borders between my private studio and the rooms where I was teaching students. That's completely different. And one of these Hadot ideas of common life, scholarship and academia in antiquity, to use those modern terms, is to a certain extent completely different. The patron is one of the indicators of this difference. And as far as I know, Candida Moss is preparing a book on patrons and their function for ancient literature, and that's one of the things we have to think about. And the other thing is what Pierre Hadot always said: it's a kind of community of common life and studying, as you said. They're walking together, and there are lots of things doing together. Yes.
Yeah, there's a book, William Johnson. I don't know if you're familiar with William Johnson, Readers and Reading Culture in the High Roman Empire. And he looks at these different intellectual communities, and reading was a central part of their day, but it wasn't the only part. They would read and have these rigorous discussions, but they would also take walks together. They would have meals together. Origen, for example, with this patron Ambrose, in book, the fragment of book 5 of his commentary on John, Origen says, he hints that Ambrose that he owes Ambrose the commentary, as if it was a kind of social contract, where Ambrose pays for the project and commissions it, and then Origen then is obligated to perform it. But Ambrose was much more than that, because in his in Origen's exchange with Julius Africanus, at the very end of Origen's response, he indicates that, you know, he dictated the letter, and then Ambrose helped him make corrections, the deorthosis, you know. So there is a very Ambrose wasn't a detached patron. He was intimately involved in everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely, and I think our image in our image of antiquity, the system of patronage is how to say, I would think underestimated. We have always to think, when looking to antiquity, the patron-client relations, and that one is a patron and a client at the same time. Perhaps Ambrose himself was in certain patronage relations, and so this is something which one has always in mind. The German problem is that patron is mostly used for Sicily and certain modern ideas. And to explain the students, this is something which has a long tradition and originally was not something for interesting late evening Italian movie parties alone against the mafia. Or that's, I think, something we have should have in mind. Yeah.
And I think another thing too, for anybody who's watching this who might not be a specialist in the field, but the Ambrose we are talking about is not Ambrose of Milan. Just in case there are some people out there who might be confused. Very different Ambroses. So I think this is going to help us then transition to the canon and the development of the canon, because you make some very interesting observations about how the canon developed. First of all, it didn't fall from the sky. You know, the disciples did not inherit the 27 books of the New Testament as we have them, nor the book of the Old Testament as we have it. You start with Athanasius and Arius, and you make a very interesting argument, actually, that Athanasius, so the first full list of a canon that we have comes from Athanasius and his festal letter of 367. And so he's writing from the authority of the Alexandrian Patriarchate as the Bishop of Alexandria. And he's responding to areas that you kind of place with these free teachers who are operating outside the bounds of formal ecclesiastical. So that's a very interesting observation. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I think the first thing we should have in mind is that history of canon is one of the battlefields between, to label it very simplifying, the conservatives and the progressives. And the idea of the conservatives is, in the middle of the 2nd century, we have the canon of the 4 Gospels, and never mind those books outside those clear-cut canon of the Pauline epistle and the Gospels. And there are the progressives. In the 4th century, we had a lot of debates on the question, what about the Hebrews or the Revelation? So that's wrong, and nothing in the 2nd century. And my impression is the first question is about which canon we are talking of, about the reading canon, about the canon. And the interesting thing of Athanasius is that the introduction is after a careful search I'm telling now the books of the New Testament. And that's quite interesting because all our young students in the religious classroom in Germany are trained by the age of 10 to count the books of the Bible. They got, don't know, a cake if doing it in the correct way. And obviously in Alexandria, young Athanasius was not trained this way, like probably not only young people in the catechesis in German churches, but also probably in Great Britain and in Canada and in the States. And my first interest was to differentiate, to bring down the canon to the question. There are comparable processes of canonization elsewhere, also in pagan literature, in Judaism, Mishnah. And the interesting question is, for what institutional framework the institution canon is functioning or is related. Do we think about the reading canon, or is it a question what is allowed to use for an argument, which is something which has a certain specific value in a religious or theological argument. Scripture says, is it allowed to use, don't know, the pastor of Hermas or not? These are completely different questions. And the most interesting question is, we are familiar with those wonderful British and Foreign Bible Society Bibles with thin paper, the whole Bible in. And realizing that the Emperor Constantine had to give from his private funds money for the so-called Bible project, which is mentioned in Eusebius. So full complete Bibles were in most of the Egyptian countryside churches had lectionaries and had parts of the Bible. We're proud of, we have the Psalms, or we have a 4 gospel book, but no one had a thick and extremely precious Bible book except Alex. And the interesting question is, obviously, Athanasius. We today, when asked if you are a person who is unable to memorize, I would leave the screen and walk to the bookshelves and take a Bible, and then it's quite clear this Bible book, and there's all things. Interestingly, Athanasius and the idea that the context of Athanasius' 39th epistle, the canon festival epistle, is that this should be related to the Arian controversy and to a certain teaching, is not only mine, but David Brecky's idea.
Yeah.
And I think we should mention his name because he recontextualized. Often we have these small source classroom books for students. And there is only a small part of the 39th festal letter. And no one knows that every year the Alexandrine bishops were delivering those letters to all the countryside communities announcing the Easter feast day, or the exactly beginning of the Easter feast and relating to the Egyptian calendar. And so the whole purpose of the text, of the literary genre festal letter, is to order to establish security, to clarify. And the interesting thing is that not only the date of the Easter fest is problematic, as we all know, we have, but next year Easter, do we know exactly? No, we have to check our schedule and learn about March or April. And the interesting thing that in the 4th century, the canon is to a certain extent insecure, like the Easter feast date, and on the other way definitely is not insecure, because it's quite clear you're allowed to use the Gospel of John as something which has authority in his words and is allowed to use as some kind of authorization of thinking, but not the Gospel of the Nazarenes or the Gospel of the 12 Apostles or whatever is included in some more apocryphal books of the two friends from the North American Apocrypha Society.
You know, a lot of people don't know that no church council ever issued a proclamation on the formal canon until the Council of Trent in the 16th century. That's the only one. And one wonders, since Athanasius is writing as the Bishop of Alexandria for the people under his ministry, whether his festal letter listing the canon would have had any authority outside of the Alexandrian Patriarchate. I don't know. But you bring up a very interesting, I always love these kinds of examples because they kind of give a personal face to what was going on in the early church. You cite this Bishop Serapion of Antioch, and he's presiding at this liturgy in Rosas, and they're reading the Gospel of Peter, and he seems to accept it because he reads it without problem, but then afterwards he investigates and says, whoa, wait a second, this gospel is pretty weird. I don't know if we should be reading this. That's a very interesting example. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this is, how to say, like a spotlight. The problem is that our history is not like contemporary history, full of sources, and there are the political archive of the German Foreign Office, full of letters. We have only spotlights to certain Christian communities, certain moments, and there is exactly the question of one small place called Rosas. Nobody knows where exactly Rosas was located. That's quite interesting. Obviously, it's such a small parish in the countryside, and they had, for reasons we don't know, the Gospel of Peter. And interestingly, we found in the 19th century this Gospel of Peter. Probably that's an interesting thing, in the grave of an Egyptian monk. And it's not really quite clear, the finding story. But the interesting thing, a quite orthodox monk in the 4th or early 5th century had the Gospel of Peter. The story you have told is a story of the late second, early 3rd century. And from the story, it's quite clear, because this story is preserved in Eusebius. Lots of people learned it's not allowed to read the Gospel of Peter in the church. And probably also in Egypt, it was quite clear. But interestingly, the monk had the Gospel of Peter as something in his sarcophagus. So it was obviously, how to explain, when religious people are asked, what is your most favorite book, Bible, or don't know, the poetry of Milton or Shakespeare, or I don't know. So the most beloved book in the Bible. So it's quite clear in the 4th and early 5th century, the reading canon is quite clear, but the canon of the most beloved book, obviously somewhere in Egypt, was Gospel of Peter the First, and that should be modeled as a battle between orthodoxy and heresy or so. No, in the same Orthodox Egyptian church, where is a kind of reading cycle or a way of how in the liturgy the for gospel canon is performed. Someone had his private canon, and the private canon of the most beloved books included the Gospel of Peter. And that's a wonderful way to bring together this positions in the battlefield of canon history without a clear-cut decision for one side or the other side. Both is true. It's depending of the situation and the place and the person and so on, and the institutions.
But you make an interesting point too. I think it's in the Codex Alexandrinus, which is one of the oldest uncial codices of the Bible. First Clement, the letter of Clement to Rome, is in there. And isn't the Shepherd of Hermas in one of those uncial codices, maybe Sinaiticus or something like that? And so those are two non-canonical texts that are preserved as part of a biblical codex.
Yes, but the interesting question is that those extremely precious codex, like the Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus, are definitely not designed. There was at this time a clear-cut difference between the books used for the reading and other codices. We know something of lectionaries, and those lectionaries were completely differently designed. So the interesting question whether one of these mentioned codices were part of the special project of Emperor Constantine to order extremely precious books and to deliver them. It's not a Protestant church where on the altar is a complete Bible, and this complete Bible is presented to at the pulpit to the community and shown as this is the whole complete Bible, and we are reading in the third part of a Pauline, apart from a Pauline letter. So books were extremely precious, and not all biblical codices designed for public use in church, some for private reading, some obviously as library books, and some for, how to say, to show them in the liturgy, as we know, and it can be easily seen today in the Orthodox liturgy. The book is presented, and whether from this book really was something read or it's only for the presentation, this is the book. Please venerate the idea of the book, but not this specific book. We are reading from a nice new printing where all the letters are far more clearer readable than in our official book, which we are presenting every Sunday.
That's an important observation. I think a lot of people in the modern world just would have a difficult time conceptualizing a book in antiquity, especially in early Christianity. The general theory, Harry Gamble and such, that early Christians preferred the codex over the book roll. So instead of unrolling the book like this, they had a codex that they could open, just like us. But to think about how big a full codex, Genesis to Revelation, would have been in the 3rd century, such a thing would have been impossible. They have scriptio continua, so no spaces between words, very little, if any, punctuation. And because papyrus and parchment were fairly rare commodities, they had to, be very economical with their use of space.
and something one should have always in mind, especially in the Corona crisis, when using all these programs, the possibility to understand people is extremely interesting, and is always something which is playing a large part in the communication. I have so often heard now the sentence, please turn your microphone on, or something like this. And in an ancient church gathering or liturgy, the possibility to understand, we have the quite interesting information that on high feasts, the sermons of John Chrysostom were translated into the Syriac language, so that in the aisles, the Syriac speaking people from the countryside could understand. Now, the interesting question is, on other days, weren't they present in church? Because they could not understand? I would not think so, because the idea I have to understand is something quite modern. The experience of a service in antiquity, only a smaller part of the people were able to read. There is the wonderful thing, Gregor Schmelz, edited from papyrus ordination documents of priests in the Egyptian language, where the requirements to be ordained as a priest are mentioned. And surprisingly, there is not written, you should be able to read the gospel. There is said you have to memorize one gospel. So probably a lot of priests weren't able to read, but they memorized the gospel. There is the wonderful story that two monks were on the way from ancient Cairo to Gaza, and they were bored by the long way through the Egyptian desert. And then one said to the other one, please, by heart, memorized, proclaim Isaiah. And the other monk did so, and surprise, surprise, when he ended performing the prophet Isaiah, they reached the gates of Gaza. Yes, it's a story, but the idea that I'm able to memorize biblical books by heart, and not able to read, and that people in the center of the church building were able to hear what is said there, but others think, oh, how nice I can talk with my neighbor, or how nice that there is something presented, we can see, there is light and darkness, there are colors, not necessary to understand. Or in the Roman Catholic Church, before the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, in Germany, there were printed translations from the Latin liturgy into German. And yes, certain people had these small booklets shot from the Abbey of Maria Laach and Beuron. They did such Benedictines booklets, but there were lots of people not buying those books and happy to have a liturgy which they couldn't understand for larger parts. No technical problems in modernity, microphones and other things, but in antiquity, the idea that all people should really understand, that's, I think, a far more modern misunderstanding, and the access of academics to liturgy. The highest of a liturgy in antiquity is not understandability of the readings and the sermons.
This conversation that we're having about books in antiquity, getting a little close to 1:30 here, so we're running close to 90 minutes, so I want to start wrapping things up. But I wanted to talk about Marcion.
Yes.
So hopefully we can end our this wonderful conversation with Marcion. And I'm going to bring it back to this issue of the nature of books and texts in antiquity. I'm going to quote you here. If one realizes that in the 2nd century the whole of Christian theology was still experimenting, then one will have to comprehend that the philological endeavors of Marcion had an experimental character as well, and did not yet reach the high level of scholarly philology that Origen shows due to his Alexandrian education. It was evidently clear to Marcion that the Alexandrian philology aimed at the production of editions of works, of corpora, and critically amended the text for this purpose, and so he edited a corpus of writings and amended the text for this purpose. Now, I found this discussion you had just fascinating. The role of philology and Marcion in the development of the canon. Origen. So I wrote my dissertation on this recently discovered collection of homilies that Origen preached on the Psalms. In his first homily on Psalm 77, Origen talks about a mistake in one of the copies of the Gospels, where the copyist didn't understand or didn't know that the prophet Asaph or the psalmist Asaph was a prophet. So in Psalm 77 or Psalm 78 in modern editions of the Bible, Jesus quotes from him in the Gospel of Matthew, so that what was spoken by the prophet may be fulfilled. I will open my mouth in parables and utter problems from the beginning. And Origen points to a copy of Matthew's Gospel where the copyist inserted the name Isaiah instead of Asaph. And this whole discussion of textual discrepancies leads Origen to a discussion of his work with the Hexapla in comparing the Hebrew text with the different Greek translations. And then after he does that, he attacks Marcion. And what he says is so interesting. He says that Marcion attempted to amend these mistakes, diorthun, from diorthao. So this is the work of philology, correcting mistaken copies. So even Origen understood that Marcion was something of a philologist.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about that?
I'm extremely happy that my argument is strengthened by Origen, because in between the publication of my German institution's book and the English translation and today, a lot of new literature appeared. Judith Liu's book, Marcus Vincent book, Daniel Roth or Roth book. So we have now a lot of new books on Marcion. And I have to confess that my idea, which is not only my idea, that one should conceptualize him as a first attempt to copy or to incorporate philology in Christian rational thinking about religion in Christian theology, I think it's at the moment not a mainstream argument, because it's a battle between the people thinking that Marcion's gospel is the first gospel and all the others are copied or whatever. And then I'm still unconvinced by these renewal of 19th century battles on the Gospels, and I'm still convinced Marcion is compare it with the Platonic philosophy. In the midst of the 2nd century, people know certain sentences and have general ideas about Platonic philosophy. Origen is part of the Platonic discourse, obviously. He is thinking about what was thought in Alexandrine institutions of higher education and higher learning how to interpret the texts of Plato. And this is a progress, and this progress is exactly the same in regard of philology. Origen is he's extremely well trained. He knows all the steps of philology. He is this wonderful thing when our daily bread give us today. He is discussing the Greek term, and the Greek term has the word ousia, substance, and so he is taking a dictionary, a lexicon, and asking what is the meaning of ousia and how this word, and so the Origen is at the same level of highly qualified philologians in Alexandria. And it's the same way as he is at this level of Platonic philosophical discussions as in philology. And Marcion is, like Justin, a beginner. And he is a quite simple beginner. He would like to do certain steps of philology without being trained in Alexandria or in Ephesus or in Pergamon or somewhere. And so the helpless, chaotic impression, it's like, I don't know, but when someone, a beginner in Greek language is trying to set up a critical edition, that would be, it's an attempt to present Marcion as a part of the history of Christian scholarship. And after having read Matthias Klinghardt, Marcus Vincent, and all the others, I'm still convinced. And so I'm extremely happy that Origen is in line with, and has, in difference to me, is able, the distance between Marcion and him is not so large as the distance between me and Marcion. So I think we should re-evaluate the idea of Marcion as philologist.
Yeah, I would agree with that, absolutely.
Convinced.
I like how you bring up Origen's discussion in his treatise on prayer, on daily bread, Epousion. I have a paper on that. One of the first papers I published, the grammar of prayer according to Origen, and the whole treatise of on prayer. He works like a grammarian, talking about grammatical principles, defining words like that.
And it's a clear, structured method, like we, for beginners in the biblical studies, have these clear-cut steps. What is first to do? First translate, then looking into a dictionary, and so. And so there is a kind of ordered into certain steps philological method in antiquity. And all these steps one can find in Origen, and it's wonderful because he's using this method a little bit confused, because in the nice passage on Epiousios, he is citing, probably with a dictionary, Herophilos or whoever in his hand, citing the entrance on ousia, and then avoiding to declare which of the meanings. And he obviously, in between a break, I'm kidding, a cup of coffee, coffee or something like that. And then, but that's a sign that there are internalized steps. I have to consult a dictionary, and then by certain circumstances, we don't know, not bringing the step to the end, I'm taking meaning A or B1 or C2, and then the understanding of epiousios is quite clear. So it's a mistake by confusion, I would think.
Well, he's certainly interested in talking about the spiritual element of the nourishment, the daily bread. So, epiousion, he splits the prefix epi from ousia, being, ousia, being. So it's bread for the being. So it's spiritual bread. It's bread for the soul, pretty much is what he wants to say. That's what he wants to do with it. Now, the philology, to wrap things up, it's so interesting that in Origen's homilies on the Psalms, he brings up his comparison of the Hebrew with the different translations very frequently. And in one of his homilies, I think it's in one of his homilies on Psalm 77, he even indicates that the copy, the antigraphon that was read at the liturgy was incorrect. It was mistaken. And so he talks about what the different translations say. And I think this is an important concept that people miss with Origen, because there's this huge debate, why did Origen compose the hexapla? And so many people think, well, he wanted to create a critical edition of the Bible. But when Origen talks about his hexapleric activities, like in his famous description in his commentary on Matthew, book 15, he says, we dare not remove these mistakes. And this I think is very relevant for your discussion on institutions, because Origen, you could tell with that, he's working within an institution and he's accepting the authority of the institution. He's saying, this might be a grammatical mistake, or it might be some kind of spelling error or something, but I'm not going to remove it because this is what we have received. And this really comes out, tell me what you think of this. This really comes out in his response to Julius Africanus, because any biblical critic today would say that Julius Africanus was right. The story of Susanna in the book of Daniel is not authentic to the book of Daniel. And Julius Africanus says that, and Origen responds, and you get the sense that he throws up his hands and says, okay, even if you're right, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to remove this story? Because this is what we have been reading in the church. So there's an element of, institutionalization going on there that Origen doesn't want to interfere with. What do you think about that hypothesis from me?
I think the first, what one can observe in the passages you have cited or mentioned is that Origen is absolutely convinced of sense in everything related to the Bible. It's full of sense. And when senseless or wrong things are presented, there is always certain sense in it. And that's, I would think, how to explain, that's not Origen's Platonism, that's perhaps a specific element of the theologization of Origen's philology. The philologist is able to explain everything. He is able to bring in sense to a mistake. That's the job of the philologist, that's philology, to bring in sense, to explain everything, to leave nothing unexplained. And the interesting thing is that in Origen theology, this key element of his grammatical training, of his being a grammarian, is brought to a theological worth or to a theological value. God is delivering it in all things sense, because it's God's revelation, and so there is always sense. Also, we bring in certain mistakes. God's abundance of sense is always visible. And the other thing, trust in institutions. Yes, Origen is, I think, convinced that also in the heretics or alien traditions, the power of God's revelations, dunamis, is in the theology of Origen a quite interesting value. The dunamis of God's revelation, because related to ratio, there is always a stronger power in rationality than in fake news and other things. That's a comment some days after something in Washington happened. There is always a larger power of rationality. Augustine never ever would accept this, but Origen's theology is coined by there is always a larger power in rationality, and rationality will will get victory or whatever. And institutions for Origen are related to rationality. And if there is a deficit in rationality, Origen's idea is, and he is a teacher, the idea is deficit in rationality, no problem. 3 future lessons and we will cover this lack in rationality. That's the serious difference between Augustine and Origen. Origen is convinced for a teacher nearly all things is possible. At a certain step, there is the wonderful image of Henry Chadwick. Henry Chadwick once paralleled the theology of Origen to the wonderful stairway of the Vatican Museum's entrance in Rome. And this is a wonderful staircase. And Chadwick said, and I think he's completely wrong, for Origen, all people are somewhere at the staircase, some at the beginning, at the entrance, but all of them will reach with the help of teachers. And there are no steps. It's one of the staircases where the stairway runs without steps, and the idea is all people are marching to the main entrance and will reach it. And institutions are God's gift on the way to reach this. That's how to say that's the optimistic way of academians of all times, because we are talking on a Friday. Monday we have again to enter the classroom, and without the idea, which is perhaps to a certain part an illusion, as the Augustinian question to us about, but to be in a friendly and happy way present in the classroom on Monday morning, it's necessary to have a deep Origenian trust in the possibility of teaching.
Well, I can't think of a better way to wrap up a really wonderful conversation than on a positive note on Origen. So, Dr. Christoph Markschies, thank you so very much for agreeing to come on here today. I should say, I run this YouTube channel with a friend of mine, Don Springer, who works on Irenaeus. And when I told him I got you to come on the show, he said, "How did you manage that?" And my response was, I sent him an email. So we have never met, and yet I sent you an email and you agreed to come on. And I thank you so very much. This was very wonderful. And I hope all of our viewers enjoyed it as much as I have.
Yes, it was a great pleasure to talk. And one wonderful thing of these new video formats and our acquaintance with Zoom and all these things is that we can, without using an airplane and other things, talk and end the wonderful Friday or beginning the wonderful weekend with such a nice talk. Many, many thanks.
Absolutely. Okay, take care and see you everybody next time.